So overall, our chapter summary, what you've learned so far. Atoms can be converted into cations by the loss of one or more electrons, so they're getting more positive, or into anions by the gain of one or more electrons, so they're getting more negative if they're an anion. Ionic compounds are composed of cations and anions held together by ionic bonds. Ionic compounds will conduct electricity when they're dissolved in water. They're generally crystalline solids, and they generally have very high melting and boiling points. Our main group elements tend to form ions in which they have gained or lost the appropriate number of electrons to reach the noble gas configuration, or a full octet of electrons in their outer shell. Metals lose electrons more easily than nonmetals, and as a result, metals usually form cations. The one exception is going to be hydrogen. Hydrogen can kind of be fickle and go both ways. It can either form the cation, lose a proton, or it can gain a proton and become the anion. Most often, it kind of acts like a cation unless it's involved in covalent bonds. So hydrogen is also useful for forming covalent bonds. So again, it's an exception to the rule. Our ionic charge can be predicted from the group number and the octet rule. So remember, use your periodic table to predict the anions and the cations that you're going to get for the different atoms. Ionic compounds contain the appropriate number of anions and cations to maintain overall neutrality. So what this means is that when you're building your ionic formulas, you have to have a neutral compound. The overall charge on the molecule has to be 0. If it's not 0, it's still going to be too reactive to exist in nature. Cations have the same name as the metal. Monoatomic anions have the ending "ide." So you're going to take off the INE ending, and so you're going to replace it with the "ide" ending. For the transition metals that form more than one ion, you have to use the Roman numeral equal to the charge to name the ion. The cation name is always given first, with the charge of the metal ion indicated if necessary, and then the anion name is given second when you're naming ionic compounds. And then the last thing we talked about was the presence of acids, bases, or salts. So an acid is a substance that yields proton ions or hydrogen ions when dissolved in water. A base is a substance that yields hydroxide ions when dissolved in water. And salts are going to be all of the other ionic compounds that do not contain the proton as a cation or the hydroxide as the anion. All of those guys are going to be salts. And then these are just the key words that you should be familiar with from chapter 3.